Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, the Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, the author of numerous novels, including the Harbinger series and Wounds and a bunch of nonfiction books, and collect a typewriter or two.
All right. I'm Molly Jo Riley. I'm producer of the podcast, and I am author of the Unemployment Cookbook and the soon-to-be released, well, soon-to-be finished and then released, mystery location novel, NOLA.
You say soon-to-be finished. How soon are we talking here, Molly?
Do you want percentage or time?
Sure.
Percentage, I am like this close to the end. Time, if you could stop all these other distractions, I could finish it this weekend.
So the podcast is a distraction for you now. Wow.
All the other distractions. I think I said other. Room, did I not say other?
Don't use your words against me. Welcome back, Molly. We missed you last week. So good to have you back. Reminder to those of you listening to the audio-only version of the podcast, we record live every other Tuesday at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. I know it's kind of late for you East Coasters, but those of you on the left coasters, you can join us in the chat room and ask your questions there and contribute your thoughts and ideas and correct us when Dad is wrong, because Pops is, it takes a team to keep him on track. So
So it's going to be one of those nights.
He came out swinging in pregame, so it's going to be an Odell Josh Norman thing here. With love, of course, with love. So if you're watching us on YouTube, we ask that you hit that thumbs up button and that you'd subscribe to our channel. We're over 100 subscribers now, so that's always nice. And tell a friend if you don't mind. Ask them to subscribe. It's really a great source for information on how to write fantastic fiction. So the more you share, the better off things are for us. It is free, doesn't cost you anything, but this is a labor of love. There are other things that we could be doing right now. We're all very, very busy, but we've prioritized our schedules in such a way that we can come to you and bring you this information. And so just subscribing and telling your friends really helps us out quite a bit. So thanks to those of you who have already done that and have done that continually and have shamelessly promoted us. We do appreciate that. So am I forgetting anything before we move on to Ask the Author?
Not that I can recall. I think you did good.
I think you were, but I forgot what it was. So.
Oh, okay. I forgot something, but you forgot what I forgot.
Did you say share the links at the top of the chat room?
Yeah.
Okay, then we're good.
I said it 1 minute from now, or 5 seconds from now. Share the links on the top of the chat room for those of you there. Full chat room tonight, by the way. I'm super excited about that. A lot of names, a lot of familiar faces. I think we might have a couple that don't visit often that are with us tonight. So really good to see you guys here. Please keep Molly busy, keeping track of comments, etc. For now, let's go ahead and jump into the Ask the Author. Tonight, Jim Keene asks through aarongansky.com. He says, if you can only afford one type of edit, such as developmental, line by line, or proofreading, which one should you pick before submitting to publishers or agents? Which I think is a really fantastic question. He also asks if we can recommend any editors. And so a lot of the editors that I know are becoming writers, or they want to be writers, and they've started editing. And so a lot of them are kind of shifting their focus from editing to writing. So a lot of those that I know have kind of gotten out of the game, but a couple that are really good that I could suggest is Alicia Morales, a friend of ours from Blue Ridge, very quality work that she does. And I'll have links to their websites on the show notes. So you can check those out at aarongansky.com probably tomorrow morning to get those links if you want. But Alicia Morales and Ben Wolf, I know Ben Wolf is still doing some editing. He's an author and editor. He's, I believe, an award-winning author. He's very, very gifted author, and so also very gifted editor. So there's a couple names that I could drop. I know they don't mind me dropping their names. I've recommended other writers to them. So
he's the founder of Splickety Magazines. There's a bunch of editions of that, different types of magazine, and they're all flash fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, he's done a tremendous job with those, and that's kind of where he's began his reputation, but he's since expanded his reputation. So, and Alicia Morales has worked on several award-winning books, etc. So they all know their stuff. Really, really good quality people as well as quality editors. So a couple of names there. In terms of what type of editing is most important, man, I don't know that there's really a good answer for that. I think it depends on the needs of your project. If you get to the end of your first draft and you feel like it's just kind of unwieldy and you've got a lot of missing plot threads that just kind of vanish, and then you know, character names are changing throughout and you just don't really have a strong direction for it, I think you're going to want to look for a more substantive edit, developmental edit, if you will, somebody who's going to be able to read the book and not necessarily correct all your, you know, commas and comma splices and end punctuation and misspellings, but somebody who's going to be able to say, okay, at this particular point, this is where your book kind of goes off the rails a little bit, jumps the shark, if you will, or the ending feels a little Deus ex machina. Maybe we can tighten it up in this way or fix it that way. So that might be where your project is at. If you have been working on this project for a while and you've cleaned it up and you feel the story is tight and your characters are well developed and everything is good, then maybe you just need copy edits, kind of the line edits, the proofreading stuff, where they are going to fix your grammar, spelling, punctuation, so that you've got a clean copy to send off to your agents and publishers. Long story short, if the publisher gets a manuscript and the story is falling apart, especially early on, that's not a book that they're going to take. They can maybe forgive a few misspellings and a few grammatical errors if they're isolated occurrences. You know, obviously if you've got 6 run-on sentences on page 1, then they're going to, you know, assume that you're not a professional writer and kind of move on. So it really depends on who you are, what your project is, and what that particular project needs most. Sometimes very gifted writers just need a developmental edit, and sometimes they've got that down, but they just need somebody to, you know, go back over their prose. So I wish I could give you a kind of a hard and fast rule for that, but I'm not sure that there really is one. Obviously, if you can afford both, you want to do that, but if you can only do one, you know, go back through your project on your own before you send it to an editor. And you'll, I think, just going to have to make a value decision here on what you think your project needs the most. Pops, what do you think?
Yeah, all good stuff. I think maybe one thing I always feel compelled to do in these things is to never assume that everybody knows our terminology. So I want to take a couple moments, if I can, to define what we mean by these different types of edits. So some of those that have been mentioned, and they'll go by different names, but the big one is substantive, development, or macro. They're all the same thing. So substantive, development, or macro, and really it sometimes even goes by other names, but it's the big picture. So that's where an editor is going to sit down and they're going to read from beginning to end, and they're not worried about semicolons. They're not worried about typos. They're only worried about is, do you have a good story? And are you consistent in the telling of the story? So if you start off and you're doing past tense, and all of a sudden you're doing present tense, and all of a sudden you're doing past tense, they're going to call you on it. And so you need to really clean this up before you go on, because it's just too many problems. Or if you're calling your protagonist Bob, and then halfway through you start calling him Robert, they'll pick up on those types of things. So they're really looking at big picture. Do you tell the story? Do you have a beginning, middle, and end? Will the reader have some kind of satisfaction? And that's what they're gauging. So that's a substantive, or the developmental, or the macro edit. Line edit's a little different, and usually when I'm asked to do an edit by either a client or a publisher, mostly what they're asking of me is a line edit. I will still do the substantive edit too, because if I see it, I'm going to call it out. And that's true with excuse me, these other editors that you use. They will usually, if they notice something wrong, that's what they'll do. They'll fix those, or at least bring it to your attention. But a line edit is going line by line through the manuscript and making sure that it is communicating properly, that the basic syntax is there, that your verb is close to your subject and that sort of thing, so that you tell your story in the clearest possible way. And so they will fix it. And one of the things you want to understand in all of this is that when you do a line edit, they are going to change your manuscript. You'll get to approve it at the end. Now, we're thinking here that you're doing traditional publishing or you're hiring your own editor. You'll get to go over all of those, but they will change the manuscript, and that's what I do. And most of these manuscripts will have a ton of changes to them. The number in the thousands, and that's normal. So that's what a line editor is going to do. They'll try to improve it. Proofreading are also copy editors, and these are special superheroes, and they are very concerned about the grammar and the usage. They correct the manuscript to make it comply with in-house rules. So if you're going to a traditional publisher, and a lot of new writers don't realize this, but there is no set in concrete grammar and usage. Some of the basics are very well accepted, but some things will differ from house to house. The Oxford comma is usually one that people bring up. The Oxford comma being number 1 comma, number 2 comma, and 3, whether or not you put a comma before the and. That comma is called the Oxford comma. And that'll vary from house to house. So their job as a copy editor is to make it conform to something, the house style with that. And these are very highly trained people, and they're also very argumentative. You put 3 of them in a room and they will self-combust because they just don't agree. I was working for a major house, one of my books, and I had 3 copy editors, and they hated each other. So they were constantly correcting each other. Somebody put a comma in, the other person would take it out. So they were heavy comma people, minimal comma people. But anyway, so I want to go the next step on that and say, if you're doing traditional publishing, that is, you're going to send it off to a publisher and you get a contract, they're going to do a copy edit anyway. If you're lucky, you'll have 2, maybe 3 people look at it. So I don't worry as much about the copy edit. So if it's me, I'm going to go for somebody to do a line edit, because in the process, they'll catch the substantive problems, the big problems, and they will catch many of the grammatical stuff too. So that's what I do. Many of the editors will do all 3 for whatever their rate might be. So I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I notice most editors really do like commas, and the ones who don't are very uncomma.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you did not just do that.
By the way, I'm getting a little feedback. I'm hearing myself, so I don't know if somebody has their speakers on or what, but...
It's not me.
Okay.
Not I.
All right.
But I'm getting the same thing too. I'm in a hotel, and so if you guys can't tell by my background, I'm traveling. I'm in Orange County today, so I'm working off the hotel Wi-Fi. So we might have a few issues in terms of reliability of signal and things of that nature. Hopefully, it won't be too bad. But if you're hearing a little bit of the audio quality being diminished, I apologize for that. Hopefully, we'll be able to get that worked out. Molly.
Yes, well, my gut reaction is comprehensive, because that's the type of editing that I do, and that's pretty much the whole enchilada. It's the substantive, it's the line copy, it's the copy edits. It all depends on what you can afford and what your project is, but since this is a First in Fiction podcast, I'm going to assume that the person that they're talking about, I'm sorry, I totally forgot his name, but I'm going to assume he's talking about a full-length novel. And after you've self-edited as much as possible, a first professional edit is helpful to make sure everything is good to go. Publishing houses will have their own managing editors who will finish the polish, but as Aaron and Al say, you want to submit a sellable product, not a first draft.
There you go. Jim Keene is the one who asked that. So Jim, we hope those answers are sufficient for you and thorough enough for you, and also enlightening for our listeners. Tonight, we are going to talk about writing edgy fiction. And Pops, you're going to kind of MC this one a little bit, right?
I'm taking over. That's all there is to it. Yeah. It's a slight rebellion here, which is why I think you went to Orange County, a little more distance.
Yeah.
That's got to be, what, 6 hours away or something like that. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about edgy fiction. Of course, we're going to need a little definition and stuff like that. And Aaron's going to be our answer guy. I'm going to be the question guy. And the reason is Aaron went to a fancy schmancy liberal university to get his master's of fine arts. You may not know this about Aaron, but he sleeps with it under his pillow, the diploma.
Yeah, I do.
Try to keep absorbing those kinds of things. But while he was there, he faced many different types of writing. And one of the things you learn once you're in the writing business is there is no standard. It ranges all over the place. There's Christian writing, there's erotica. If you can imagine it, somebody's writing it. And books that even sell are Amish vampires, for example. So there's no telling what you're going to get. But edgy fiction is a topic that comes up quite a bit, and we often get questions about what is edgy fiction and what can I get away with and those kinds of things. So Aaron, tell us, from your experience, what is edgy fiction?
Edgy fiction is really kind of a broad topic that covers several different things. Really, the way I kind of think about it is any sort of kind of non-conventional subjects or non-conventional structures, which I don't often talk about, but I saw this a lot as an editor for the Citron Review, which is a literary magazine I founded after I was out of my MFA program. And I got a lot of people who would submit work that was somewhat theoretical in its structure. It was, bleeding edge or groundbreaking, or they wanted to try these interesting new techniques. I read one that was one sentence. It was a 1,000-word sentence, and or I've seen some where every sentence or every word begins with the next letter of the alphabet, and they try and tell a story that way. And to a certain extent, that's just more cutesy than it is anything else. But it kind of gets the term edgy in terms of structure and trying to break conventional norms. But I think when we talk about edgy fiction in the popular culture, what we're talking about is fiction that tackles difficult subjects, really taboo subjects, things that people are not necessarily writing about because maybe they're uncomfortable subjects. This could be something like rape or sex trafficking or human trafficking, genocide, mental illness, and suicide. There's still kind of a negative stigma with stuff like that. Not everybody wants to pick up a suicide book. Of course, there's 13 Reasons Why, and look at that, it's a suicide book. But if I wrote a suicide book, chances are people aren't going to want to read it. Just because there's one book about that particular subject that's typically taboo in our culture that's successful doesn't mean all the other books in that same genre writing about that same subject are going to sell equally well. This is an especially relevant topic, I think, in the Christian market, because if you're writing for that market, there's a lot more taboos than there are in the secular market. Obviously, the secular market's a lot more open to different things. However, when you think of something like the Game of Thrones, and you've got George R.R. Martin writing about things like incest and infanticide and patricide and all these types of things, not what you normally get when you read a fantasy series. You don't normally think you're going to read a lot about these types of sordid affairs and this type of violence and gratuitous romances, if you will. And yet it's a cultural phenomenon. And I think what a lot of people mistakenly believe is that if they write about a subject that is as sensational as something like that, that it's going to garner interest and literary acclaim. And that's what I think the attraction for writing edgy fiction is people think that the subject matter itself is what's going to end up selling their book. Did that kind of define it well enough?
Yeah, I think so. And if I'm understanding you here, you're saying that edgy can be a couple of things. One, it could be the form that's being used to convey the story. And, I always call that experimental fiction, like the 1,000-word story with no punctuation or just all in one sentence. Okay, and that's fine if you're being experimental. If you're trying to make a living, then you have to ask yourself, is anybody going to buy it? And so that depends what kind of writer you want to be. Am I trying to be artistic, or am I trying to have a writing business and provide a certain type of entertainment to a certain group of people, whatever that might be? And really, take Stephen King, he writes horror. And so a lot of the stuff he deals with is edgy because it puts us on edge. And is that a good way to think of it? Edgy fiction might be fiction that puts the reader on edge because of topic or the way it's told.
Yeah, and that's a really good way to say it. I remember Rob Roberge, who's a fantastic writer, but content warning on his novels for our listeners. But I was lucky enough to have him as a mentor when I was at Antioch, and he put us through this exercise where he wanted to demonstrate that tension can exist between characters on the page, but there can also be a tension between the text and the reader. And that's when we start violating some of these social norms. And he did I don't know that I really want to detail it, but he had us do this writing assignment. I'll say it this way. He had us write a romantic scene. Two people deeply in romantic love. Okay, so we wrote that. And then he said, okay, now imagine that one is the parent and one is the child. And you're like, wait a minute, what? Now it's awkward and weird. Now it's not okay. And now the tension, there's no tension on the page. There's no tension between the characters, but there is tension between the reader and the text. And that's kind of what I was talking about, those social taboos, those things that are still somewhat unsettling for us to read about. And so that is more what I would qualify as edgy fiction. There is edgy kind of experimental, like you say, experimental fiction. I think for the sake of this podcast, so we're going to focus more just on kind of the subject matter and how do you write edgy fiction and should you be writing edgy fiction and those types of questions.
Okay. Yeah. Paul, you had a question?
Well, I was curious what other examples there are of edgy fiction.
The ones that come to mind, I read a ton at Antioch. One is Mary Gaitskill's Bad Behavior. It's a collection of short stories of people behaving badly. Imagine that. Dennis Johnson's Jesus' Son is probably one of the best collections of short stories that I've ever read. You read about a car accident and you think that's really, really beautiful. It's weird. It can be unsettling at times. It's largely about drug abuse and what people do when they are under the influence and how it's ruined people's lives and those types of things. That was, I think, what would qualify as edgy fiction. I'm sure there are a million other examples as well, but those are the ones that come to mind first.
We sometimes use movies to describe this, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, Aaron, because as you were talking, I began to think of this. You had encouraged me to see a movie, and I remember your comment was, you're not going to like the movie, but you're going to like how they made it. Is American Beauty, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so American Beauty, and you were correct. I saw the movie, and when I got to the end of the movie, I thought, I was on edge because it had so many things in the story I did not like. I did not like a single character. The protagonist was a chump. Okay. There's no one I liked in the book. However, the story was told with such beauty. That is, we're talking now about the cinematography, the pacing, the lighting, the acting, everything that goes into making a movie was just top notch all the way through. So at the end, I'm thinking, man, I hated that story, but I loved that movie. And that's really an awkward position to be in. So I think, well, would I recommend this movie? Probably not, unless I did it the Aaron way. Yeah. You're not going to like the movie, but you're going to like the way it was done. And so now, does that carry over into the written word?
I agree. Yeah, I absolutely believe it does. I think if we're able to analyze something and look at the artistic quality, the artistic merit of it, and evaluate it on those on that level, then you can still enjoy something that creates tension between you and between the text and the reader. I will go ahead and throw another example out there, though, and this is the risk that you take, and we'll talk a little bit about this kind of in the next question of whether or not you should or should not write edgy fiction. I went to see American Beauty, and to me, thematically, it was talking about the different way people perceive beauty and what is beautiful to them and what moves them to do what they do. And you're right, all of the characters, there were very few, if any, redeeming characters in there. I think the son is the one that's the most sympathetic character. But you come out of that movie going, that movie said something. It had something to say, and I heard it. I didn't like the way I heard it, but I heard what it had to say. Contrast that with the movie Election, and oh man, did I just admit in public that I'd seen that movie?
Yeah.
I recommended it. I told my friends to go see it. I said it has Reese Witherspoon in it. She's got a very adorable nose. How bad can it be? Turns out really bad. Yeah, really bad. And that movie had a lot of taboo in it, taboo subjects in it as well. A teacher sleeping with a student. Same thing. I didn't like any of the characters. Halfway through the movie, I'm thinking the only happy ending here is for them just to burn the school down with everyone in it, and then that's good. That's the only happy ending. It was so bad. It had nothing of value to say. There were no redeeming qualities. It was just a bunch of nonsense. It was more shock value than anything. And I think that's a bad example of quote unquote edgy fiction, are those types of books.
And I agree with you. I think that's where some, especially new writers, get confused. I think edgy fiction, it must be shocking fiction. That isn't necessarily the case. It's the emotion it elicits within the reader that puts them on edge. There's something about it, whether it's, it's violence or tension or whatever it might be, but it's something that puts you on edge. Well, okay, so now we know what edgy fiction is. Help us out here, Aaron. Tell us whether or not we should be writing edgy fiction.
Yeah, my general rule of thumb is you should only write edgy fiction if you can't not write it. I understand that's a double negative, but I think it's an important distinction to make. If you're writing something like Election, just like the shock value, the sensational quality of it, oh, look at me, I'm pushing boundaries, and you know what? No, that's the wrong reason to write it. However, if you've got a story to tell, and that story is somewhat edgy, and it's going to challenge your readers, perhaps make them a little bit uncomfortable, but it's for a purpose, then by all means you need to tell that story. If that's a story that needs to be told, and you feel that story must be told, it's kind of your job, I think, to tell it. But don't just write sensational things for the sake of being sensational. I remember reading I won't mention who wrote it. It was a very famous, very wealthy author who probably doesn't even write his own books anymore. It was one of those. Yeah, no, you still write your own books. You haven't quite reached that level. But in it, there's the beginning scene is it's almost like a scene of swingers, right? Like these two couples that are going to get together for romantic purposes, I guess, and then one couple kills the other couple, and it goes into detail. Like it measures, it tells you in meters how far the blood was spraying out of the neck and things of that nature. Oh, it was just it was awful. It was so over the top and gratuitous, right? And that's the risk when you're writing quote unquote edgy fiction, is you don't want to be overly sensational. You don't want to be gratuitous with it. You don't want to just put it in there just to have it in there and say, "Ooh, look what I did. I'm so fancy." That's the wrong reason. Here's another example of edgy fiction: Grapes of Wrath. I mean, at the time that was written, championing the migrant workers and those people coming from Oklahoma, trying to find a job to feed their families, and what the establishment was putting them through. These types of things, these social changes, it's not fiction, but pretty much everything that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote would be considered edgy in terms of the non-violence and those types of things. Challenging social norms can be very edgy. And if you are writing for that purpose, that's great. But avoid just picking things for the shock value. Shock value writing, shock value edgy fiction is really bad. Those tend to really fall flat, and they don't have an impact on the reader. Instead, they just really put the reader off. So it's risky, but I think it really goes back to your heart. If there's a project that you care about deeply, that you feel will challenge readers in some way, whether you're writing for the Christian market or the secular market. If you're willing to challenge your audience through your fiction, and you think it's for the best, and that you want to tackle one of these sensational subjects, then I think, yeah, go ahead and do it. Just be aware it is kind of high risk, high reward.
Molly, I think you had a little something on this, didn't you?
I did. Sorry, I was in the chat room. Yes, I was saying that yes. I think also here, because it's edgy, that readers expect more from it. They don't want just salacious details. They want it presented in a well-written way. So if you can't write without sounding like a gossip columnist, I said that wrong. So if you can't write without sounding like a gossip columnist, you probably shouldn't write it. The argument for most edgy fiction has always been not, I can't believe he or she wrote that, but rather it has some tough themes, but it is so well written. That's the goal that you want.
And I think it goes back to the kind of the difference between Election and American Beauty. If you can appreciate what it has to say thematically, then, and it can only be revealed through that type of edgy fiction, quote unquote, might be something for you to consider doing. Yeah.
So would you say Charles Dickens wrote edgy fiction?
I had not considered that.
I have to remember his time.
Yeah. Challenging the social norm. Exposing the problems of society, where it's a lot easier for us to just not think about it. I kind of think of, for me, that would be something like human trafficking. Like it's a reality, but it's a lot easier for me in my little bubble to not think about it, to imagine that it doesn't exist, because it's more comfortable for me to go through life that way. If I, however, were to read a piece of fiction that put a face to it, it's perhaps going to challenge me and challenge my thinking and say, you know, you're comfortable in your bubble, but maybe you should be doing more to help out this cause. Here are some things that you can do. Now, I'm not saying that you need to write crowbar fiction. I guess let me kind of define what I mean by crowbar fiction. Crowbar fiction is where you have a message and you write a story just to fill that message. And so it sounds somewhat contradictory for me to say, only write edgy fiction if you have a point to make, but don't write fiction just to make a point. Like, that sounds contradictory. So let me see if I can explain what I mean. If you want to write about the horrors of human trafficking, and you can do it in a nonfiction expose article type thing, or heaven forbid, a memoir, a personal experience, you know what? Nonfiction is a great way to do that. But I probably wouldn't write about human trafficking because I don't know enough about it. And it's you know, not necessarily something that's been put on my heart. But there are some other things that I do care about deeply, that I feel can be challenging in some ways. And those are more of the themes that I find myself drawn to. The story, I think, should announce itself. And if the story has, as Molly said, difficult themes that need to be explored, and it's going to make the reader a little bit uncomfortable, okay, but let it come naturally from the story. The reason I say avoid crowbar fiction is because I always have some students who want to write about the horrors of drunk driving, and then they're like, someone was drunk and they drove and then they killed a baby. And it's, you know, they don't put any thought or effort into the actual fiction of it. They just kind of want to make a point. And I don't think fiction is the right vehicle for that. If, however, you're writing about somebody, a character, if your character has been deeply affected by drunk driving, i.e., I'll give this example here, if you'll indulge me. Had a speaker come out when I worked at Serrano High School. I had a speaker come out and to talk to the students about drunk driving, how bad it was. And he told the story about how his brother was killed by a drunk driver. And his brother got into a car with a guy that he knew was drunk. And one thing led to another. Of course, the driver survived, but his brother was the one who died. So he goes through this whole thing until he gets to the last like 10 to 15 minutes. He's been showing you this PowerPoint presentation, all the pictures, everything else. And the last 15 minutes, here's the twist. He was the drunk driver. He had killed his brother. If you've got a character like that has made some sort of mistake and is recovering from it and the fallout from it, that kind of pathos is going to be a lot more, it's going to resonate more with the reader rather than just simply telling a one-page, the horrors of drunk driving type of a story. It needs to be natural. It needs to come from character. It needs to come from conflict. It needs to have a profound impact, not just, oh, he wished he had never had a drink that night or something like that. It's got to be a little more poignant. There's got to be more to it than that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'm thinking of, because a lot of people, I believe that edgy fiction is fairly recent. And one of the points I'm trying to get across is it's not. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Some consider that one of the first science fiction stories is quite edgy. Fahrenheit 451, which we've mentioned. We've already mentioned Dickens' writings about orphans and child labor. So many of those things. Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had a big part in starting the Civil War. Those are edgy books, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
Because they tackle something that other people, they probably wouldn't talk about, but they'll read the book and then it changes them some. So we're kind of into our next question, which is fiction the place to be edgy? And I'm guessing the answer is yes.
I mean, it is a place to be edgy. If whether or not it's the place, I think is up for debate. There have been several nonfiction works that have helped change the world. For example, On Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau, which impacted Gandhi, which impacted Martin Luther King Jr., which impacted Cesar Chavez, and on and on and on. The Declaration of Independence, it changed the world. There are nonfiction documents, essays, memoirs, biographies that have had profound and dramatic impacts on society. But I think what we tend to remember more as a society are these novels. We mentioned Grapes of Wrath, which is unsettling. I know a lot of people think that's a very hopeful novel. At the end is very hopeful, they say, and I don't see it. To me, it starts off depressing and gets worse. One of my particular favorites, Slaughterhouse-Five, which I'm in love with, and it seems bizarre. It's about a guy who time travels and is on an alien planet. He's abducted by aliens that look like plungers. And you go, well, that's just ridiculous. But then you read it, and at some point you're like, wow, like Vonnegut has something to say here. And it sticks with you, and you think about it, and it sits with you. Fiction has a way of impacting you in a way that nonfiction, I don't think, can. So I'll give this example here. I've read two books by Tim O'Brien. I've read several books by Tim O'Brien, but two I remember. If I Die in a Combat Zone is his memoir, his nonfiction account of when he fought in the Vietnam War. I also read The Things They Carried, which is a collection of short stories. Some people call it a novel. It depends on how you want to classify it. But if nothing else, the short stories are all connected in some way. The Things They Carried sits with me in a way that If I Die in a Combat Zone doesn't. Well, it seems opposite, because the nonfiction one is the true account of what happens. Doesn't hit me nearly as hard as The Things They Carried, specifically a short story called How to Tell a True War Story. I'll put a content warning on that. But man, if you want to read some incredible literature, something edgy that's going to challenge you and the perceptions that you have about war, that's a story to read. And it sits with me. I don't know how to say this other than nonfiction will convince you to believe something in your mind, whereas fiction will convince you to believe something in your heart. And those are, I think, two very different things. Does that make sense?
It does. I usually explain to people that nonfiction is education or its explanation. Fiction is experience. So the reader experiences it. I will, however, because I'm a big proponent of nonfiction, and I've done several nonfiction books, have found nonfiction books that move me as much as novels have. One being, which I've mentioned on this show several times, Day One, which is about the dropping of the atomic bomb. Now, I think everyone ought to read that. Whether you think it was a good idea or a bad idea, that's immaterial. It happened. And this was just an accurate account. And he was the only person that I know of anyway, and there may be others, but in my experience, that described what it was like to be on the ground. Many people have talked about what it was like to drop the bomb. But in his book, he talks about what it's like to be a child in the school near where the bomb went off. Okay, and but he used fiction technique. So when I did my nonfiction, 60 People Who Shaped the Church, 30 Events That Shaped the Church, when I did those two books, for example, I did the same thing. And I tried to make every nonfiction person seem like a character in a novel without, changing the facts. I tried to use that century-rich kind of thing. So both can be very good, but it is true that the reader will, in reading edgy fiction, will go in and they will drop their shields, be involved in the story, and now they're emotionally invested. And the fiction will it will tug on the emotion, where nonfiction often will do that, but it mostly tugs on the mind. Two go together, but the target's a little different. Molly, you had a little something on this also, I think.
Well, I did. When I was reading the show notes, it came to me that as a newbie, how I was analyzing what you guys are saying is that nonfiction edgy writing could be equated to doing an expose on something, whereas fiction edgy writing is just that. It's fiction, and it's fiction. It's not hard facts and expose and trying to expose something, get to the middle of it.
There have been some studies done, and I think a lot of people don't understand how powerful fiction can be. But there have been some psychological studies done, and that the human mind in a fiction state, such as when you're watching a movie, for example, cannot distinguish between reality and fiction. That's why first time I watched Alien, and I'll tell you what got me. If you watch the show Alien, they have these little pods and things that live inside them. And I was a biology major at the time, and there's this astronaut in his suit, and he looks over and the pod opens, and there's things kind of moving around. And I leaned in. I thought, that looks real. And I leaned forward, and that thing jumped out. Of course, it eats through his helmet, and it buries itself in his throat and stuff. But anyway, I had leaned forward into that. And from that moment on, I had trouble telling myself this wasn't real. And I would do that. I'd sit there and I go, this isn't real. This is just fake. It's just a story. Then I'd end up screaming like a little girl. Of course, everybody was screaming like a little girl in that. So it does have that impact. Same thing if somebody is caught up in a book. That's why they'll cry in a book. You can make people weep. You can make them laugh. You can do all of those things. And in that, especially if we're going with the definition Aaron's given us here about edgy fiction, that it has some kind of impact, sometimes socially challenging to us. Since we buy into that, we're no longer just reading about it, we're experiencing it, and that sticks with us longer than, say, a lesson out of a nonfiction book.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
Well, does writing edgy fiction increase my chances of being published?
Well, it really depends on a lot of things. I would not write a piece of quote unquote edgy fiction just because I think it's going to increase my chances of being published. However, there are times where people write edgy fiction and it just happens to be the right subject at the right time. And then, boom, it explodes. Normally, I feel like writing edgy fiction can complicate your chances of being published. Publishing is still very much a risk versus reward type of a business. They want to minimize their risk. If you are writing something that they don't think will sell because it's going to make the readers uncomfortable, it's going to get some unfavorable reviews, let's say, then perhaps they shy away from it. Maybe they don't publish it. But occasionally you'll find a publisher who recognizes that this particular edgy fiction is well written and challenging and has something to say, and then you get The Things They Carried, or Slaughterhouse-Five, or The Grapes of Wrath, and any number of Charles Dickens novels, and that's where you end up getting, I think, increasing your chances of being published. But if you're writing edgy fiction just to get published, I think you're in it for the wrong business. Again, I think it goes back to, is this something that needs to be told? I would argue that for any novel that you write, if this is a story that's inside you that has to come out, then you write it. Publishing should not be your first line of thought. I know a lot of people who say, oh, I'm trying to think of a book that the market's going to like. Well, good luck with that. I mean, if you could figure that out, you'd be a billionaire. Look at Harry Potter. Nobody believed in Harry Potter except for J.K. Rowling and then one little publisher, right? But it was a story that was inside her. And when did she make it big? When she decided, I don't care if I get published or not. I have to finish this. And when she did, that's when she got published. If you sit down and think, well, Harry Potter is really popular, I'm going to write a wizard book. I'm sorry, there's 600,000 other wizard books that are currently being written and being published, trying to get on the coattails of that. Edgy fiction is I think, somewhat the same way. If you're just trying to ride the coattails of whatever is in the media, then you're probably going to be behind the game. If I sat down, and this, I don't mean to be controversial at any point, but if I sat down to write, let's say, a Black Lives Matter kind of a novel, because that's in the news, I could write that and it could get published and I've got something to say and it's going to change the world. 2 years later, when the book is finally hitting shelves, is it still going to be a hot topic? Who knows? You roll the dice and maybe somebody says, oh, you really missed it on this one. But if I started writing about a cop that had killed an unarmed black man 4 years ago and it got published 2 years ago, well, now this seems like it's ripped straight from the headlines and this is relevant to our culture right now and it has something to say. And so it's really, you asked a simple yes or no question. I feel like I've given you a very complicated answer. Sometimes, but it's really, again, publishing should probably not be your primary motivation for writing edgy fiction. Again, it has to be a story that's inside you that needs to be told by you.
Well, that's what I like about you, Aaron. You're the only guy I know that'll write an essay on a true-false question.
True or false? Sometimes.
True. Well, first, what do we mean by true? No, but all those points.
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1. All those.
Let's examine the scantron,
really
shall we?
And while you were talking, I got to thinking about something that's I think about a lot.
So you weren't paying attention to him, is that what you're saying?
No, he was saying something that reminded me of things that have been that I've just observed. Let's take American Idol, for example. And all these people will go by, and you can very quickly tell the difference between those who say, I want attention and want to be rich, and then those who get up there who love music. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things I've noticed, for example, even among rock bands, you think even like heavy metal, what are these guys really after? And you talk to them, they'll be interviewed, and they will start singing the praises of some other artist, some other performer, the way they play the guitar, the music they play. A lot of people don't realize, for example, the Beatles and so many other groups what really motivated them were the blues and rhythm and blues. And those are the people they studied, and they're the ones that they praised, and they loved them so much, they learned from that. And so they became successful, not just because they wanted to be successful, but because they loved the music. They served the music. Now, you and I have we've been to these writers' conferences, the three of us, been around the country doing these kinds of things, and we get this same dichotomy. We get people who want to be a writer, and if you ask them why, they really can't tell you. Mm-hmm. And then you find those who love the writing. They love storytelling. They love books. They praise other authors. That's what they talk about. And those are the people that go on to have success. And there's just really a big difference between that. I don't know if any of that made sense.
It does.
does.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
My favorite quote is Isaac Asimov, where he says, "I write for the same reason I breathe, because if I didn't, I would die." And a friend pulled that for me, 20 years ago. And that's kind of been my mantra ever since.
Yeah, Ray Bradbury in Zen and the Art of Writing, and many other places and speeches he gave and stuff, he was really rebellious. He would say, you just write. You don't care what the others think. Okay, you forget the publishers. Okay, it's the story that matters. You write that story.
Mm-hmm.
And if you will do that, your stuff will sell, because you've connected and you love and you bring in the techniques that you learn, and it isn't about you. The best writers in the world don't spend a lot of time talking about themselves. They'll talk your ear off about their story, but what goes on with that, but they usually don't spend a lot of time talking about themselves. Well, this pushes us into the next thing, things to keep in mind when handling edgy topics. We've already talked about a few of those. You got any more for us, Aaron?
Yeah, I think the first and last rule for handling edgy topics is simply empathy. I have read the Game of Thrones novels. I know that makes me suspect in several people's eyes.
That's it. You're dead to me.
You're a bad person, Aaron.
No, hold on. It gets worse. Before you disown me, let me really give you a reason. As you've probably heard, there's an incestuous relationship, a twin brother and sister. I knew that Martin was an incredible writer when I was reading that book, and he was writing from the point of view of the sister, and she was explaining her love for her brother, and I was thinking, yes, I get it. And just saying that out loud makes me feel really uncomfortable. I'm like, I'm a little sick to my stomach right now, because never in my life would I ever know. But I believed that she would, and that he would, and that's kind of empathy, being able to take something that is so taboo and write about it in such a way that the reader feels some sort of empathy for that person is a real challenge, number one. Number two, it's easy to demonize people who are involved in those types of activities, etc. We talk a lot about, the making complex characters and the ultimately, the villain who ultimately has a good heart and all those types of things, and the flawed hero, and everybody has to have positives and negatives. Nobody's truly, truly evil. And I'm sure there are some truly, truly evil people in the world, but when you're writing about some of these things, you need to be able to handle it with a certain amount of empathy, and recall that sometimes the bad guys are doing the bad things for the right reasons. Writing about mental illness or suicide, if you're not doing the research and writing about it appropriately, it will be offensive, and you're going to end up offending the reader. You don't want to do that. You're going to have to handle it with empathy, and those types of things. If you're not doing the research and trying to write with empathy, you're not going to write anything there will be no change that comes from your book, except perhaps some outrage on the part of the reader. That's not the kind of PR that you want. You don't want to be offensive. You want to be empathetic. Secondly, have a purpose. Again, I've said it before, the story has to be inside you. If it's inside you and the story has to be told, go for it. But if you just want to make that point, or you want to say, hey, look at me, I'm edgy, that's a recipe for disaster. Last thing I'm going to say is readers like to see characters overcome. I'm not going to say that you have to have a happy ending. You can sometimes have that unhappy ending, and a lot of times, I know people say Grapes of Wrath has a happy ending, but not the way I read it. I'm pretty sure I read the same pages as you, and that is just weird and creepy and unsettling. I know people want to look at it thematically, and people tell me Les Miserables is an uplifting film, and I'm like, wait, what?
No.
Did you? No. I mean, it's just, you got to watch it with a bottle of Prozac candy. Like, it's sometimes
a bottle of something anyway.
Yeah. it's not, characters don't always overcome. However, readers really like it when they do. So it's okay to write something that's going to challenge your reader. But if you want to be a commercial success, typically you're going to want your characters to overcome. Again, it's not a hard and fast rule. It's just something to consider. Are you writing for social change? If so, maybe you don't have a happy ending. If you're writing to tell a good story and you want to have commercial success, maybe your characters win. Really, what I would say is look at your story and what does your story demand? What does your story want? What's the ending that your story has to have? And that's what you need to be true to. So those are kind of my last thoughts. Pops, I don't know if you have anything, any last minute.
Yeah, a couple more things before we see if there's any questions. And I've done some edgy fiction and did some early on. One was called Terminal Justice. And the question I wanted to deal with is it ever right to do wrong? And that was the first question that came to me. Is it ever right to do wrong? Is it ever right to break the law? It starts with the question, if your family was hungry, if your children were dying of starvation, would you steal bread? Knowing that it's a criminal act. Well, of course, you have to ratchet it up a little bit. And so one of my characters, who is a bit of an anti-hero, does just that. And so I asked the question, how far would you go to save a life? How far would you go to save 10 lives? How far would you go to save 100,000 lives? Would you lie? Would you cheat? Would you kill? And that was the basis for the story. I did one on euthanasia, where people want to take their own life. And at the time, there's just a lot of conversation. And I understand the dichotomy. No, you can't. You shouldn't do that. Yes, you can. I understand both sides. I did a lot of research on it. What was missing, however, was heart. And I got to thinking, if somebody wants to argue against a person's right to take their life when they're in a hopeless and painful situation, you don't get to do it with arrogance, at least not in my presence. Okay, You better do it with tears in your eyes. I can understand why you believe that or why I might believe that, but I don't get to do that with any kind of arrogance. It needs to hurt. I think it was Spurgeon was talking about that. He said, if you're going to preach about hell, you better weep in the pulpit. You have no right to be arrogant in the pulpit about that. You deliver that sermon with tears. So that's often what we're dealing with when you deal with that kind of edgy, socially based, individually based, emotionally based kinds of fiction. Is it had better be moving you. Otherwise, you'll never move your reader. Well, Molly.
Wow.
Do we have any questions? Or do we bum everybody out?
No, it was really, there was a lot of discussion in the chat room, but a couple of questions. The first, right off the bat, is a comment from Dave Fessenden. He said he gave Aaron an idea for a book today, and less than 8 hours later, Aaron sent the first chapter.
I'd like to go ahead and correct that. I believe it was less than 4 hours later. So I don't, I mean, I'm not good with math, but it was definitely after lunch when he gave me the idea. Darn you, Dave, just let me finish my books. You're giving me all these new ideas.
Well, suck it up. You wanted some ideas, didn't you? Isn't that what we talked about? You were running out of ideas, so there you go.
Yeah, I should have just asked Dave.
Do we get to know what the idea is? That's my question. Do we get to know what the idea is?
No.
Wow, you're rude.
I really am. It's a great idea, though.
Okay,
I remember somebody asking Tom Clancy what he was working on. He says, I never talk about a work in progress.
Yeah, I know a lot of people that don't.
Live television. He says, no, I don't talk about that.
Interesting.
I'm writing a book. That's what I'm doing.
That's what I was going to say. Well, Andy Clapp commented that he just submitted his proposal and manuscript for a Christmas book to his agent Friday last week. So he's asking us to pray for him and pray for that.
Christmas book. Yay. I love Christmas. I've been thinking a lot about Christmas lately.
We all love Christmas. Christmas is 5 months from today. So woohoo! That makes me so happy. Dave Fessenden asked if edgy topics can't they become kind of cliche?
Oh, absolutely. And they often do. In the same way that vampire books become cliche and werewolf books and whatever else is hot. When something sells, people jump on that bandwagon. And so, yeah, it can absolutely become cliche. And again, I think in the slush pile of all of the books with similar topics and themes, you can still tell the ones that were written with heart. You can still find the ones where the story demanded to come out. And those are the ones that are true. Those are the ones that really resonate with readers. And those are typically the ones that survive the firestorm of, the flash in the pan type of popularity. I think I'm mixing a lot of metaphors right there. So
it sounds like you are. We did have a good discussion about vampires and zombies. No questions, really, just that vampires and zombies. Dave asked, Aaron, are there parable or allegory elements in a lot of edgy fiction?
Ooh. Animal Farm.
Al, would you like to take this one?
Animal Farm.
That's a good one.
It's an analogy, but it's tugs at your heart, and it says an awful lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it can be a vehicle for that. Absolutely. The form, again, I think is not necessarily as relevant as the subject matter, as the message that it's conveying. So, yeah.
Okay.
I can't think of it off the top of my head, other than Lord of the Flies and Animal Farm. I'd be hard pressed to think of Pilgrim's Progress, maybe, but kind of Narnia. But again, I don't know that that's really edgy so much. It is definitely an allegory, but I don't know that I would qualify that as edgy.
Right. Becky Lindsay is working on the second book in her YA series. The 4 high school girls have she got a contract. She's going to be published soon. I'm so happy for her.
Wait, she got a contract with
Elk Lake.
Oh, that's so exciting. They're doing my Rock and Roll Romance, which will be out July 31st.
I think it was Elk Lake. So if I'm wrong, Becky, correct me. But she says that she is writing the second book in the series. The 4 high school girls have had some tough issues, such as sexual abuse mentioned in book 1. Because of this, she wants to write about one of the girls thinking she might be a lesbian. It's an issue that the church is not dealing with effectively and lovingly, in her opinion, and she wants to know your thoughts.
I think that is an area that is definitely edgy in the Christian market, and I think it is risky in terms of looking for publication, but I'm going to stick to my guns and assert what I've been asserting this whole time. And if that's a topic that's near and dear to your heart and needs to be told, you need to tell it. And I want to avoid being overly political, but I believe I agree with you. That's an area that should be challenged within our market. It is something that is not often talked about. And I think that, we need more books that will tackle that will challenge readers in that regard. Again, it's definitely going to be something that needs to be handled with a certain element of grace and empathy. And I trust that you'll do that because I know you and I've seen your writing. But there's a lot of publishers. There are a lot of publishers who will probably say that's a no-go. But I also think that there are a lot of publishers out there that are a lot more willing to explore some of those topics now.
Yeah, there may be a few more, but I want people to understand why that is, since you brought up the Christian market. And a lot of authors don't think this through. You can have an important topic and a publisher can publish it. But what the publisher also has to think is, how much blowback am I going to get? And they think, well, now they're just being cowardly, but they're not. They have a business. Some of them have stockholders. But what happens in publishing is, if enough readers get upset, they start taking the books back to the bookstores. That's less and less now since it's done online. Okay, but they send the books back. And when the books are sent back, they can't be sold again, so they're trashed. In fact, some places they just rip the cover off and just send the cover back. And so you get enough of that, and then the publisher gets hurt financially, which also impacts the original author. But if the image, it tarnishes the image of the publisher, then it affects the other writers, and then it affects their families and their employees, and there's this whole domino effect. And this was the thing with The Great Gatsby. Was it Scribner's Sons? Sorry, I started with the wrong publisher. faced this problem with The Great Gatsby, and if it wasn't for Max Perkins taking that book under his arm and keeping it secret, it never would have been published there. And the reason is part of their clientele were churches and Sunday school literature. So they had whole departments dealing with that. Great Gatsby, doesn't dovetail real good with that. So now what they have to do is they have to weigh, okay, it's a great book. It's edgy. Okay. It's got something to say, but it may destroy a whole department. So, publishing is if you walk into a publishing house, you're not seeing a business, you're seeing a casino, because everything for them is a toss of the dice.
Right.
If I bring this author on, will they deliver? If we get this book out, will it sell? Will the market change on this? And on and on and on. They're constantly tossing the dice, hoping that they get enough good numbers for the thing to take off. And they never know if they will. And sometimes they hit it big, and sometimes they almost go out of business.
Yeah.
And that's, so it's always been that way. It's not just the Christian market. There's always this, how much impact can we take and do this?
Right.
So it's not purely that they're scared or they don't agree with you. It's a whole lot of factors they have to weigh that the author doesn't have to weigh.
Well, I think that's an important conversation for us to have in the content text that we were just saying. We don't want to demonize anyone. We're not here to demonize publishers. We don't want to even call them an anti-hero, but like you say, they've got family. They've got, sons and daughters that like food and drink, and they like to be able to have school supplies for the school year that's coming up. And if they make a bad decision on a book or a risky decision on a book, and it causes half the publishing house to close down, there's a lot of considerations that need to be made. So we're not trying to demonize publishers who shy away from edgy subjects, but we just want you to be aware that there are some publishers who will.
Just to understand why there are at times reluctance to deal with it. And that's what they have to weigh. And also, there are very few publishers where there's a single decision maker.
So lots of people who make those decisions.
And one publisher buys up another publisher. So sometimes, even if they wanted to do it, they may have certain criteria set down that they don't do that. So, it's real world.
We should write an edgy novel about someone writing an edgy novel.
Okay.
Edgy publisher. All right. So that's getting too meta. All right. Anything else, Molly?
Nope. That is it.
What a great question to end on. So thank you all for participating in the chat room. So good to see so many of you there, and the great conversations that you guys are having just warms our hearts. It makes the labor of love a little bit easier when we know we're going to be able to see friends every other week and be able to talk with them about what we love. So in a couple of weeks, our next show, we're going to be talking about writing the suspense thriller. With a suspense/thriller that will be on August 8th, Tuesday, August 8th. So in the meantime, don't forget to ask the author, which you can do at aarongansky.com, or you can just contact us on Facebook or on Twitter or any other social media site that we are on. You can reach us at altongansky.com, franklymydearmojo.com, and at aarongansky.com. So we thank you so much for listening, and until next week, good writing.
Oh, wait. Did you click it yet?
Yep.
Oh, it's so